Welcome. This is a partnership between the College of Engineering and pre-college programs, and talking about systems thinking. This is the activity Gone Fishing, but we do have a number of other systems thinking related activities that we'll share links to on our website. Getting into why should you be thinking about systems thinking? Why is this systems thinking important to be teaching to your students? Because it's not one of those subjects that I think teachers are really thinking about is teaching systems thinking. When Oregon adopted the next generation science standards, they were really unique. These three strands of the engineering and science practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts. And focusing on the cross-cutting concepts here, systems thinking is embedded in that when you see systems and system models. But really, as you look at all those cross-cutting concepts, they're all part of being able to have students understand and study systems. And really, once they're able to understand and study systems, they're able to use those systems to solve problems, and big problems and complex problems that they're going to be facing. And so I think building these skills in students as early as possible is going to help them become successful problem solvers as they move through not only their K-12 education, but beyond. Next slide. So here's our, we call them the IME team, Industrial Manufacturing Engineering, but we have a partnership with the MIME program at ORSU. It's the College of Mechanical, Industrial, and Manufacturing Engineering, and specifically Dr. Javier Calvo, who has a research interest in systems thinking. And so about 4 years ago, as part of the Senior Capstone Project, we started working with industrial engineering seniors as part of their capstone project to develop content specifically aimed at teaching middle and high school students about systems thinking. Here you see the group that we have this year, and we have Dustin Deep, and he is going to be talking to you more specifically about the lesson that he created, the Gone Fishing lesson, and hopefully you will be able to use it. So I'm going to turn it over to Dustin, and we'll go more in depth into systems thinking and the lesson.
Before you do, I think somebody has, Heather has her hand raised. She's had her hand raised for a while.
Heather, you want to unmute yourself?
Sorry, that was not on purpose.
Okay. Well, you know how to use it. If you do have a question, raise your hand and we will we'll be getting to you. Okay, Dustin.
I need to unmute myself. Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. So I'm one of the 4 seniors. You can see my dorky picture here on the left. That was part of this team. So I'm going to be going over the lesson. First, a little bit of an overview of what is systems thinking. So just get a background of what the concepts overall are that are covered by these lessons. First thing, a definition for systems thinking. Here's a bit of a tautological definition, but systems thinking in general is a method of thinking used to think about systems. That's probably not a very useful definition, but overall it kind of describes the cognitive behaviors that we undertake in order to process what is going on in a system. And to that end, we use some work done by a guy named Derek Cabrera. And what he did was he broke down systems thinking and found empirically that in general, we use this set of rules called DSRP. It's the set of 4 rules called the distinctions rule, systems rule, relationships rule, and perspectives rule. And each one of these kind of describes a part of the cognitive process that we go through in order to think about systems. The first rule is the distinctions rule, in which is essentially how we draw distinctions around things. How do we identify something as what it is and what it isn't? So everything kind of has a definition. If I'm holding a cup, I know that this cup here fits within this kind of physical boundary of this is the cup and everything else is not the cup. So how do we draw the distinction around what is and isn't the cup and everything else? The first important thing that we use when we think about anything. Really, we have to be able to distinguish between what is a thing and what isn't that thing. The next rule is the systems rule. You can see that all of these rules kind of have two words next to them. They help you kind of identify what are the different components of the rule and remember them. So systems rule is kind of part whole. It helps you remember that everything can be considered a part of a system, and everything is also a whole that's made out of parts. So this interesting dichotomy. So, this cup is a part of, you could say, the system that is my room right now, of all of the other things in here, and it serves a purpose of, delivering water to me when it's full anyway. But the cup is also made up of parts, be it the glaze and then all of the individual molecules and whatever is inside of it too. So all systems have parts, and they're also wholes, and they're also part of a larger whole. The relationships rule is pretty important for systems. It's defined as action-reaction, but essentially all of the different parts with the system interact with each other in relationships in order to start to exhibit the system behavior. So that's pretty important. At least in the cup structure here, all of the molecules are in relationships with each other on a very physical level. They're all bound to each other to create a structure that represents what I'm holding right here. And finally, there's the perspectives rule, which is point view. So based on whatever perspective you're taking of a system, it also changes how you apply the first three rules, the first three thinking processes. So if I'm looking at a large system, like say healthcare or government or the economy or something, we can look at the entire system from the perspective of, say, the political system, as well as social and cultural aspects, to financial aspects, to whatever you want. And depending on who is defining it, you're going to change how you draw distinctions, how you see different parts within the system, and how there are different relationships, be it, say, financial, cultural, or social, or political, etc. Why systems thinking? The main reasons that we talk about this is that, one, the rules of DSRP, since they describe cognitive process, they actually, when you explain them to students, they help give them a vocabulary that allows them to think about how they're thinking, develop cognitive skills, which can help them become better learners and problem solvers. And the other thing is, systems thinking as a whole helps us address the complex problems that we're experiencing today, which current methods of problem solving can't really address. So we created 4 lessons based on each of these rules. Essentially, each lesson is based on one, and the relationships lesson is the gone fishing lesson, which we'll go over today. But as Jay said, we'll be sharing out the rest of them at the end of this workshop. So a bit of a question now, a bit of a pause. Now that you've heard more about systems thinking, how are you, could you teach, or how are you teaching systems thinking, or how could you be teaching systems thinking to students? And you can respond to that in the chat. I think we have a couple minutes set up for that.
Yeah. And a lot of times you're not teaching systems thinking maybe directly, as Dustin just explained, but using situations that encourages students to think more systemically about problems or understand a system in more detail, so they can be able to predict what that system is doing.
Adam says cell theory, cells the ecosystem. So that's using that systems rule. Yeah, Emily says a classroom garden. So each of these has parts and wholes, and they all interact with each other. Marine science, some of the relationships part, ecosystems and sustainable fishing, food webs, right? Food webs are great because you can see all the relationships. This consumes that.
Yeah, science fair projects, MSS science fair projects of trying to, depending on what they are, looking at a lot of those interconnections that may come with whatever subject matter.
And so I love all of these examples, and you can see how these 4 rules, they have to be applied. They're applied at the same time in parallel. Actually, whenever we're thinking about anything, distinctions, you have to be able to identify the parts of a system, consider what parts belong to the whole of the system, how do the parts interact with each other, and then you have to see what perspective you're taking on the system. Are you a member of the system or an outsider viewing it, to change up how you apply those first 3 rules. So it's used pretty much everywhere, and once you start thinking about the rules, you're going to be unable to stop thinking about them. That's what has happened to me anyway. So lots of good examples. I think I should keep moving, right, Jay?
Yep, yep. Let's
Okay.
go on to the simulation.
All right. So this lesson is built mostly around a simulation. It's called Gone Fishing. It's actually from a book where the game was called Harvest. So I might use both names in case I forget to call it Gone Fishing. But it's a book that's called the Systems Thinking Playbook. So modified it out of there. First part, we jump straight into running the game. So what we're going to do is create 3 to 5 teams of students. In this case, it's participants. We're going to have 3 teams. Teams are already numbered off, and we're going to have one person be kind of a runner. Originally, when this game is run, you do it in person, and you have a bunch of physical teams, and folks are manipulating objects back and forth between us, but that won't really work in this case. So we kind of have pre-assigned teams, and we have one person from our side being the runner between each team. So every student or person is going to would get one worksheet as well. I'll kind of go over those later, and then you're all going to be placed into separate breakout rooms to really help divide everybody up into teams. So the introduction to this, so the breakout rooms will be handled in a bit. Introduction, congratulations, you and your team are the proud brand new owners of a small fishing company. So your goal as a fishing company is to try to catch the most fish over the next few years in order to earn the most money. You can make a name for your fishing company if you so choose, or give students the chance to do so. So the game rules, we play through 4 to 6 rounds, with each round equating to 1 year's worth of fishing. And we start with a population of 50 fish. Now, when this game is run physically, we actually have a cup full of pennies. So that's why there's this image here of a fish equaling coins, because we actually have physical fish going on. That doesn't quite work here. And so each round consists of 2 phases, of a catching phase and a regeneration phase. So your goal is to try to catch these different fish. So during the catching phase, within 30 seconds, within your team in the breakout room, you're going to try to determine the number of fish that you want to catch. You can modify this time as you need to, depending on how you're running it. And then the runner will actually leave the breakout room to tell me the catch quantity individually. And then I'm going to collect everybody's different catch quantities, how much fish they're trying to catch from teams 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to fill them randomly. So I'm going to reply back to the individual runner who's just messaging me in the chat individually how much fish they caught. So if there's enough fish in the ocean, let's say that Sue-Ann asked for 10 fish, or her team decided on 10 fish, then I'll say, okay, you caught 10 fish. And then that reduces the fish population. But you have to keep in mind, though, if there aren't enough fish in the ocean, I'm just not going to fill the order at all. So if you requested 60 fish, there's only 50 fish in the ocean, or even 40, I'm going to say you didn't catch any fish. So that's the important thing to know. The orders are filled randomly, and if there aren't enough fish to fulfill your order, I'm going to not fill the order at all. Most importantly, I'm not going to share how many fish were caught by anybody. That's pretty easy to see now because we're all in breakout rooms, so none of you will be able to talk to each other unless you got text messages going on in the background, but I don't think so. During the regeneration phase, so once the fish are caught, your runners are going to return to you and tell you whether you got your catch. I'm going to regenerate the fish population. So the regeneration rules are simple. We double the number of fish that are left at the end of the year. So if there's 20, it becomes 40. But the fish population is capped at 50. So if there's 30 fish left at the end of the year, I'm only going to refill it back to 50. While I refill the fish, this is usually when students have a worksheet in front of them. They try to record the number of fish they caught and then decide on the next number to catch. And then we repeat this for a few years and see who manages to win out of this. Are there any questions about that? I know I went through it relatively quick, but it'll make sense after a couple of rounds of playing. Okay, so I hope that was fun for everybody. I know it's a little rushed, but I think it's pretty neat that we can pretty much replicate how the actual game feels in person. That's about the speed that we try to push everybody at to make sure the lessons finished on time. It's fun to watch the kids jump up and down about it too. Okay. So what I've been doing is that I actually have a table that kind of let me keep track of how everybody's team is going. I just put everybody's name at the top and made it a lot easier to keep track of. So the way this table works, everybody's back, right? Yeah.
Everybody's back.
Okay. So the way this table works is that I put everybody's orders in here, and then I just type the actual. I've been rolling a dice actually to just figure out which order I want to fill everybody's order in. And then I punch the numbers in, and it automatically calculates like what the remaining calculation is, or remaining population is, and how many to refill. And so we can see what happens to the starting population over time. So with that, this thing is smart enough to kind of like plot the fish population over time and also plot everybody's catches over time as well. So students really enjoy getting to see this part because they can get to see the results of kind of what they did to everything. So a couple of explanations for these graphs. I'll zoom in a bit. The first one is just the overall fish population over time. So this is just what the starting population was at the end of each round was. And then we have the total fish caught per round. So this shows like the amount of fish caught each round. The dashed line is the number of fish ordered, and the bold line is the total number of fish caught. So you can see anytime there's a gap, it means that people caught less fish than they originally ordered as a group. And then this graph is kind of repeated for each one of the teams as well. So you can see when a team made their order and when they didn't. So for this part, I'm gonna like brush over any discussion portions, but I will show like kind of what questions you ask at each of these parts. So what we do here usually is just ask the questions of kind of what did you observe? The two big questions that we want to ask are what did you observe happening to the fish population over time? And what do you observe happening to orders over time? So we're trying to get them to describe behaviors over time. And usually the answer is they both go down. I try to tease out like a more nuanced description of like first orders went down very fast and then they kind of mellowed out, and the same for the fish population. Fish population went down really fast and then kind of flattened out towards the end. One thing about the spreadsheet, which you'll all have access to, is that there's instructions, but B, I also have an example from another simulation we ran with another class back then. So you can see pretty much the same behavior over time for everyone. Is just everything kind of exponentially decreases over time, and orders always go way over what the fish population can actually sustain. Let me check. So any questions about this part at all in the chat?
And this is usually a great, the graphical representations are a great way to get students to really start to see that ultimately this system is failing for everybody, right? It's failing for all the teams, it's failing for the fish, and can look at going past that, what is going to ultimately happen to this fishery over time, not only just to the fish, but also to the fishing companies who are limited on how much fish they can catch. So it's kind of an example of a failed system, or a system that's not optimized in our favor, I guess.
The team that did win though was team number 2, Emily's team caught 33, and Suan caught 31, and Adam's team caught 20. So Jake was asking that. I'll move on to the slides then. Let me see. So this gets into the debrief part. Usually review results, and here's my 2 key questions. What happened to the fish population, and how did orders change over time? There's a worksheet that students usually have. I can actually bring it up. So this is the worksheet students would normally be working with. Here's where they'd write their strategy. They have a scorekeeping table for themselves. And then here's the debrief answering these 2 questions. And then we go kind of the next slide, kind of on what Jay said, I asked the question, I'm curious, did anyone really win here? And then why or why not? And we start to ask, like, what could be a better goal for the game? Because as we said, like, we decimated the fish population. Everybody's starting to like win a lot less. And if you start to frame things in terms of the actual, like a real life scenario, it's like, will we actually like want this behavior in the real world? Because people probably depend on this food. And like, if they all run out their fish population, they're going to run out of food or something. So you can discuss maybe a better goal for the system is to like be able to still, for everybody to be able to harvest enough food, but not destroy your fish population or something. Be sustainable. From here, we get into the systems thinking portion of the lesson. So I run through going through like the relationships rule and thinking about how to build those. Apologies, I don't actually like get to run through this discussion portion, but we're crunched for time. So in this slide, I ask how to define a system. We go through an example of just looking at a car. I say, if I take all the parts of a car apart, would I still have a car? Just like pull it all apart. Why or why not? So the answer is no. All the parts have to be in a certain relationship in order to do so. So I define a relationship here. It can be a cause or effect, action reaction. They can look like physical connections or information flows within a system. So then I define what a system is. A system consists of parts connected to each other in relationships or interactions, and together exhibit an overall behavior. This is a pretty common system dynamics definition of systems thinking of a system. So here I kind of draw out the different parts of a car and I show them, hey, you can have all of these different relationships between them. And this exhibits a certain behavior, which is locomotion. Then as a class, I provide them with an opportunity to go through the next part of, or to try to model their own system. So I actually provide in a worksheet. This is the next part they would have. They actually get the different parts of a system. So I asked them to model a classroom system. Here's some different parts: student, teacher, worksheets, desk, class, computer, presentation, because the classroom itself is a system. I just asked them draw some of the relationships between them. Here's where I'm really trying to get at the learning objective of being able to draw basic cause and effect relationships, or those action verb relationships between different parts in a system, trying to build that skill at a very basic level. They get a few minutes to go through that. And then I kind of just pop up an example and show, here are some of the ones I found. We can have an in-class discussion about this, or some sort of discussion online if you're running this virtually, about what relationships that they drew. They might be able to call out which ones match the ones that they drew, or they might have come up with ones themselves that aren't here. And then you get to say, great, I didn't think of that one. That's cool. And then they feel better about themselves, good about themselves. Overall, I asked them what behavior that this system is supposed to exhibit as well. And we can see that it's supposed to be learning within a classroom. So after that, we get into modeling our game system. And what I found was it's actually a bit too difficult, at least at the middle school age, which is what we kind of designed this lesson for, to develop a proper model of our system. At least even if I give them all the parts of our system, drawing those relationships is a bit difficult. If you're a high school teacher, you might be able to get away with assigning this, especially in a virtual system or a virtual format of getting everybody to model the system there. But I just do an overview of the key interactions within the system. So I have different parts, and then I just show the different interactions between these parts here. And there's some animations which help make it a bit easier to understand. So here's kind of the interaction between team one. They determine an order which removes fish from the fish population, that returns a catch, which adds to your earnings, and then is read by team one again. So when you get the information back, you determine the next order, and you kind of repeat this first cycle. I duplicate it for the second team. And then there's another relationship between fish population and regeneration rate. So fish population determines the regeneration rate, which goes back and refills the fish population. Usually students are able to at least find this one if you are having them model it. This loop right here is a bit more complicated to find. So this is why I just kind of give them the example, but in general, they're at least getting a bit of a taste of doing this sort of activity from the classroom system example. Okay. I asked them to, I think my animations are out of order. I show them that there's a couple of loops that you can see within the system, and I ask them which loop is connected to how the fish population changed and which loop is connected to how the orders changed. So if you remember those two questions that I asked at the beginning, how did the fish population change over time and how did orders change over time? That's directly connected to these kind of loops that we see in the system. So this one right here is that kind of exponential decay of the fish population. And this one here kind of shows the mechanisms behind how the orders decayed over time as well. Hopefully I'm staying on board with everyone. I know I'm rushing a bit here. Let me see. So the next part of this, we asked some questions of how could we improve the system. So within another couple, 3 minutes, have folks work together either individually or as a team. And we actually give them a picture of the system here. And we're asking, how can we improve the system? So some questions they could think about: what elements might they add, change, or remove? Or what relationships might they add, change, or remove? This part's pretty challenging, but everybody usually has one or two ideas about what they would change about the system. And then you can have a very interesting discussion about that towards the end. Let me see. So after this part, this is where the debrief part ends, and now you have the option to run through the simulation again. Keep in mind though, it does take a bit of additional time once you've gotten to that part. I personally, when the lesson is designed for the 45 to 50-minute range, which is what we had, we never got to run through a second simulation. But given that you're in a virtual format, or if you're just using this as a normal lesson, you can run through a second simulation with some of the rules that students added, and you can observe what results came out of that. And sometimes it will probably end up with some really cool ones, especially if they make a change and it turns out it didn't change the overall behavior. You can have a really rich discussion about that. Just gonna do a quick time check here.
So I think we have a couple minutes where if people want to comment of what sorts of changes that they think would help this system out, like what different rules would you put in to make the system more successful? And so we have a couple minutes. You can either unmute yourself or put them into the chat.
I see one is regulatory body and catch limits. I can actually scroll up. This contains my entire lesson plan. So yeah. Actually, I have a list here within the lesson plan that's associated with this lesson. Here are potential solutions that students have responded with. So yeah, I'm getting good ones here. Regulatory body or catch limits, which it goes under the limit the amount of fish each team can take. One's add communication between teams. A fishing charter, yeah. Ones that students typically jump on are increasing the regeneration rate, increasing the starting number of fish, or just doing a first come, first serve system. And the cool thing is these first three solutions actually won't change the overall system behavior. It might go a little bit longer, but you're not changing the underlying structure. You're just changing like one number, but it doesn't change the overall behavior. So if you increase the regeneration rate to a certain extent, people will just take more stuff as a result, and you'll still bottom out the fish population. You increase the starting number of fish, people just take more at the very beginning, but you'll still see everything peter out towards the end. And having orders filled as they come in will probably help the success of one team, but the overall system will still be decimated by the end of it. Adding communication between teams and limiting the amount. Well, I'll get into the fourth part of this lesson. I think we've gotten some good results here, but you can see how the final changes look. So show me my presentation again. Oh, I don't want that. Okay. So the last part of the lesson is to actually explain a common systems archetype called the tragedy of the commons. Some of you might be familiar with this. So I have some definitions here. So a systems archetype is a common system structure that we can observe in nature. Some are, or just in systems in general. Some are more common like balancing loops, reinforcing loops. But this one is called the tragedy of the commons. So this is a situation, just read it out here. It's when a shared resource is used selfishly by a bunch of individuals without considering the public good, which eventually leads to spoiling the resource for everyone. Sounds pretty familiar, right? So what I have here, I actually run through a few examples. This is optional for your students. Here's a few different situations of tragedy of the commons, and you can ask, what's the shared resource? What are the users? What are the results that happen here? So one is just like overfishing, which is what we just went through. Another one is, here's the swimming pool. What's the shared resource? The pool. Who are the users? Everybody. What are the results that happen here? Well, everybody wants to use the swimming pool. And as a result, it's so crowded that no one can actually enjoy the swimming pool. Here's another one, which is traffic congestion. Everybody wants to use the highway, and then it gets slowed down and nobody can really use the highway. And then the last example I have here is also climate change, the atmosphere. Someone made a comment about pencils in class. That's pretty funny. Students will actually point out, like when I showed the traffic example, they talked about the hallways in class between passing time. They said like everybody wants to use it and it gets crowded and nobody can use it. So they make the connections real fast once you talk about it. The last one is the atmosphere. It's a common resource that everybody can use and then everybody just pollutes willy-nilly. And it turns out everybody ends up feeling the effects of its degradation and also climate change, which is pretty rough. So you can have a discussion here within the worksheet. There's actually an option to extend this into an assignment where they fill out a table. Where is it? Over here. So they can actually describe a scenario, a shared resource, users, what happens in this situation, and then potential fixes as well. And there's an empty column at the bottom so they can come up with their own example. You could even assign this as some sort of take-home assignment if you wanted to, depending on how much time you have. Finally, so I go into solutions. One is a centralized governing body. Another is strengthening the consequences of what happens. So if you're creating pollution, if the pollution was dumped straight onto your front door, you'd probably take some immediate actions to make sure you reduce the amount of pollution you create or eliminate it entirely. And the third one is to educate and just have everybody communicate with each other to make sure they're aware of the consequences of their actions. So in terms of system changes, I believe one that we talked about, so one solution that was suggested, which would actually work, is adding communication between the teams. So that changes the fundamental system structure and adds a relationship between the two teams. They talk about each other, they talk with each other so that they can coordinate how much they're ordering. The other big system change that they could make is a centralized governing body or regulations, which would understand the fish population. You know, we have an understanding of how the fish population regenerates. And based on that, it actually applies an additional limit on the orders here. So there's another fundamental change on the system structure, which can result in a change to the system's behavior. So that's where I end the lesson there. I believe you can add a kind of a concluding slide or a recap slide at the end to talk about all the different things that were covered. And I think that reaches the end of the lesson. So any questions that you have here, please let us know. We can discuss distance teaching options as well, Jay.
Yeah, so we put together different distance learning options for this lesson. Obviously, you can see that it could be a little bit tricky as far as trying to run the simulations, especially given the fact that you may have to run that simulation over a longer period of time. And part of the fun of the simulation is providing communications within the teams to develop strategy and to fill fish orders. We came up with 3 different options. One being synchronous, which looks very similar to what we were doing using some sort of video conferencing platform, whether it be Zoom or Google Hangouts or some others. Many have the same or similar options that we have. We also looked at doing this asynchronously, where you divide your class up into teams, and each person is assigned to a team, but they act as sort of an individual, and then you're taking averages of those of the numbers. So if you're on team 3 and you have 7 students on team 3 and each of student turns in an order number, you're taking an average of those numbers, so it allows you to be easier on the data crunching side of things as you're putting them into the spreadsheet. And then thinking about how you would divide up those different rounds. Is that going to be, are you going to do this over a day where every couple hours is a round, or are you going to do it over a week period? And then finally, we talked about non-digital sides of things. There are some examples. The directions are fairly clear, and while it may be a heavy lift for some students and parents and guardians at home, but this could be run with family members sitting around a table and thinking about what are the effects of the simulation. And once they go through that simulation 1, as Dustin said, you don't necessarily have to go through the second simulation, but really talking about the system in general and improving or modifying or adding to those relationships within the system can actually have a big effect on the sustainability of the system. So those are some ideas, but I was hearing that you were talking about other ideas in the breakouts during the first simulation. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that as you are thinking about how would you deliver this to your students at distance. And feel free to unmute yourself or put your comments in the chat. And this page that you see here that's so small that you would never be able to read it on the screen, that is on our website, and feel free to download that to have more details about different forms of distance learning. So testing regeneration rate might be a fun way to test the model. I think while we didn't run simulation number 2, and sometimes it doesn't fit well within a class period to run simulation number 2, distance learning provides maybe some more time to have students really think about, okay, if I make these changes, how can I test this model, the simulation, utilizing the simulation with those changes to figure out which changes are actually beneficial? Because as Dustin mentioned, there's a lot of changes that can be made, and sometimes the first changes that students are thinking of in our experience that actually lead to no change, maybe just a few more years of fishing, but ultimately it's not changing the dynamics of the system. And that's, I think, where a lot of the learning occurs, where students are trying to figure out the solution by understanding the system itself, instead of just throwing solutions out at and not realizing that those solutions that may be short term are actually causing problems in the long term. Jake is talking about having a lot of students that aren't able to participate in distance learning. So having the idea of doing the simulation with their family and then report back sounds good. I think that would be a great way to do it, is providing an opportunity for students to be able to do this with a family, or maybe connect with a few friends and do the simulation on their own, and then go through those questions that are on the worksheet. Those worksheets have been added, and they have been put in, they're in a Word format, so you can modify them, and students can actually fill them in and then turn them in if that was desirable. So we have about 2 minutes left, and if you have any final questions, feel free to post them in the chat. I really appreciate everybody coming today and learning about systems thinking, and hopefully we've convinced you that systems thinking is something that you should be teaching in your classroom. I want to remind you that PDU certificates will be sent out to everybody. Everybody that is here today registered through Ideal Logic, so you'll be getting those. We do have sessions every Tuesday from 10 to 11. So same bat time, same bat channel. I know some of you are repeat offenders, and thank you very much for coming again. Next week, we'll be looking at bloom in a bottle, and this is a way to grow and model hypoxic zones, either in lakes and freshwater systems, such as we hear about toxic algal blooms, but also the hypoxic zones that come up off the Oregon coast. So make sure you go to our website and sign up for more sessions. And again, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll be seeing you in a virtual PD session soon.
And other reminder is that there are 3 other systems thinking lessons that you can explore as well. Some may adapt to the virtual format even a bit easier than this one. So.
Yeah, and I'll make sure those get up on our website. They're not up there now, but we'll put them under this section, the 3 other ones that link to the DSRP that Dustin talked about earlier. And I want to give a final big thank you to Dustin for taking some time as he's about to graduate at the end of this term, right, Dustin?
Yeah.
He's about to graduate at the end of the term, and for sharing this lesson. He and his team did amazing work over fall and winter term of producing these lessons. So we're hopefully get them out there for you all to be able to use them. So thanks again, and we'll see you all soon.